Professor here, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Law, Language, and Cognition. I can't tell you how pleased and honored I am to be able to introduce our speaker, Tom Tyler. Tom is the Macklin Fleming Professor of Law at Yale, but he's also a professor in almost every other department as well. He's also a professor of psychology and a professor at the School of Management. He had been chairman of the psychology department at NYU and subsequently, or coincidentally with it, a university professor at NYU, which is a great distinction. I've known Tom for quite some time, and he has been singularly influential in bringing together the fields of psychology and law, particularly the idea of the question, how is it that the law has to go about being legitimate for it to gain respect from the community and be a guiding post of the community? He's approached these kinds of problems from many different perspectives with respect to many different institutions and has been enormously influential with respect to his work. So without any further delay, the floor is Tom Tyler's.
Well, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me to speak to you. Over the years, I've been here many times at different conferences, many organized by Larry, and it's always been an exciting intellectual opportunity to talk to the people at Brooklyn Law School. So I was pleased when I was invited to come and speak to you and to talk about the work that I'm doing at this particular point. And so I'll talk about justice, but I won't start with justice. Larry said that the topic was going to be, can the legal system do justice? Unfortunately, I write a lot about justice, but I'll start talking about legitimacy. And the point that I'll make is that as a psychologist, I can imagine several different ways in which there can be a connection between people and the societies, the communities, the organizations that they're involved in. And to make that contrast really striking, I'll just refer to them as coercive and consensual. And I'll talk a little bit about the dominant form that we have in the legal system now and a possible alternative. If we look at the way we talk about law and legal authority in most contexts, most of the time in the United States today, we talk about a model that's really drawn from economics and has the view that people are motivated by the threat or use of force, coercion, basically. And so the law creates the possibility of punishment, and often then there is punishment, and those forces shape people's behavior. But there is a different model, and this is a model that I'm obviously going to be advocating for when I talk to you today. And that is that we focus on consent. And we focus on the idea that people can accept and cooperate with law and legal authority because they think it's the appropriate thing to do. And so it's essentially a consensual system. Well, why is this relevant today? I want to talk about this in the context of what I see as the kind of discussion that's going on today in the legal community and more nationally about declines in the legitimacy of authority. We're increasingly talking about the idea that Americans in general seem to be losing faith in institutional authority. Probably the most striking example is declining trust in the national government. It's always great to throw up a slide of public trust and confidence in federal authorities. This is not even the worst. Congress would be worse if I put just Congress. This is the federal government in general. Do you have trust and confidence in our federal government and its authorities? And you can see that over a long period of time, we've seen a steady and quite striking decline in trust in national government. Now, I think it's really important not to catastrophize here. So I've also put up the National Opinion Research Center index of all our many national institutions. It includes government, includes banks, religion, scientific community, big business. And you can see that there's also a striking and steady decline, but really not as striking. And so, although we recognize declines in trust and confidence, we don't want to say that the bottom is falling out. Particularly, those declines have slowed in recent years. But in particular, we're concerned about law and legal authority. So what can we say about the way Americans feel about the police and the courts in our society? We can say several things. One, that views are moderately favorable. A majority of Americans trust the police and courts, but not a particularly striking majority. And that level has been very constant across a long period of time. So let me show you how we would know that. This is confidence in the police and courts over the period 1980 to approximately now. And what it shows is, first, that we've been a lot more interested in the police than the courts. So we have a number of national surveys of the police and a fewer set of surveys of the courts in general, and then surveys of the criminal courts in particular. What they show is that between 50 and 60% of adult Americans express trust and confidence in the police and the courts, and then that's fairly stable across the last 30 years. Trust in the criminal courts is, like trust in government in general, declining. And then in particular, when we talk about the police, we see a striking ethnic difference, race difference. And this is approximately 25 to 30% different, and it's been maintained certainly for the last decade. We could go back far into history and it would be even more striking, but the point is it's not disappearing. The gap still persists. And in fact, this recent 9 months has been a striking example of discussions about trust in the police and courts in the minority community because of a series of incidents involving the police, and we could add even more incidents that have all had a racial component to them. So in general, we've seen increasing focus on the issue of trust and confidence, in particular in the case of law with the difference between whites and minorities. And this has become a focus of discussion among national leaders. We've seen the Attorney General Holder, we've seen the Director of the FBI, we've seen the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, all talking about legitimacy as the key issue. So let me tell you a paradox concerning legal authority when we think of it from this point of view of trust and confidence. If we were having a discussion about the police in particular, because the police have the most contact with the public, what we would be saying is that in the last 30 years, the police have become much more professional and competent. So that in general, despite the existence of obvious examples of injustice, the police are much more capable, they shoot fewer people, they are not as corrupt. The National Academy of Sciences points to a really striking improvement in the quality of policing in America. And the main issue that the police have been focused on, violent crime, has been strikingly declining in recent years. And you can pretty much go anywhere in America and put up any figure from any city or national figures, and you'll see striking declines in the rate of crime. There's actually, when you go see police chiefs at meetings, they make jokes about how you can get up in the morning and go out and work on your garden all day long and then go in at night and have a press conference about how the crime rate is going down. Because no matter what the police do, the crime rate keeps going down, or what they don't do. But the point is, if the police are being evaluated in terms of their ability to control crime, you certainly couldn't argue that they're not doing a good job. So increasing professionalism, seemingly able to better control crime, yet these lacks of translation of that into trust and confidence. So that leads to the question about legitimacy that I want to talk about. If, in fact, professionalism in these objective terms, if crime control are not the factors that shape popular legitimacy, where does legitimacy come from? And maybe related to that, do we care if it exists? That if legitimacy is not being driven by professionalism or crime control ability, why would we care if the police and the courts are legitimate? Well, first, let me just say a word about what we usually mean when we talk about legitimacy. Obviously, we're not talking about objective legitimacy. We're talking about perceived legitimacy, whether the people in the community think that their police and their courts are legitimate. And when we measure that in surveys of the public, we usually look at three different things. One is attributes that we might describe as encapsulating trust. Do you think the police are trustworthy? Are they honest? Are they concerned about the well-being of people in the communities that they police? A second is obligation. Do people feel that they should accept decisions? If a judge makes a decision, should you obey it? If a police officer tells you to do something, should you do it? If a law exists, should you comply with it? And then a sense that the police and courts basically enforce values that the public agrees with. Idea of normative alignment, that the police, the courts, the things that they're doing, the rules that they're enforcing are the rules that the people in the community actually accept and think are appropriate and proper. And all of these things are measured in public opinion surveys, in the data that I'll talk about that's in the paper that you have. All of these are used as measures basically of legitimacy, perceived legitimacy. All right. Well, to first say a word about why we should care. One of the really striking results of social science research in recent decades has been the tremendous importance or impact of perceived legitimacy. That a number of desirable public behaviors, and I'll go through these, but across a variety of desirable qualities from the public related to the effectiveness of law, legitimacy drives behavior. So we're losing benefits of effective social order maintenance when the public doesn't view the police and the courts as legitimate. Now, this is true on several levels. First, in terms of personal interactions with the police or with judges, people are more willing to accept authority when they view that authority as legitimate. They voluntarily defer to that authority. They follow decisions over time. Many years ago, when I first started out, I worked for the American Bar Foundation. The big issue was people didn't follow judges' orders. So someone would go to court, they would get a judgment, and then when they tried to enforce it, they found that people just wouldn't do it. That has maintained itself as a core question in law ever since. People don't accept decisions that are made by police officers. They don't do what police officers ask them to do. They don't follow decisions made by judges, and this creates problems. And as we've seen most recently, people often react to their interactions with the police by getting very angry and fighting back. And this resistance and hostility leads to often very tragic outcomes where levels of force escalate. These things don't happen as much when people view the police and courts as legitimate. And then more broadly, people who think the law and its authorities are legitimate obey the law. They cooperate. So they cooperate with the police. They report crime and criminals. They are witnesses. They, in general, are more willing to do the things that would make it possible for the system to work more effectively. And then they're less likely to engage in extra-legal, violent actions. If you take many of the incidents that we've seen recently, when there is a questionable shooting, the police always say, give us time to investigate. Wait, we'll investigate. Well, it turns out that if people don't trust the police, they don't do that. They immediately take collective action, sometimes extra legal action, because they don't really have confidence that the police can be trusted to investigate. So on all these levels, there are costs when the public doesn't have trust and confidence in the police and courts. So we should think about legitimacy as it exists in the community as a distinct issue that's important in its own right. And just to make the point that I think is really central to my argument about this, this is really different from most of the discourse that has dominated our discussions in the last 30 years. There are two issues. If we had gone to a meeting, for example, of police chiefs 10 years ago, the entire program would have been focused on basically crime control. What kind of policies and practices can best suppress crime? Effectiveness was defined in terms of crime control, or perhaps sometimes service delivery. How quickly do we respond to 911 or 311 calls? The other discussion, what is lawful? Here, you are probably well aware of the reams of law reviews that have been written since the Terry decision about whether police practices, whether court practices are or are not consistent with the Constitution and the protections that we have for people in the community. These are important issues, but my point to you would be neither of these issues is found to be very central to the public's understanding of whether the police and the courts are legitimate. In fact, different issues dominate public reactions to the police and courts, which is why these changes in professionalism and level of crime have not impacted on trust and confidence. So we need to ask distinctly what shapes public trust and confidence, what shapes legitimacy. And what I'm going to do is to try to use this question about legitimacy to talk about a transformation in the nature of law and the relationship between law and legal authority in different communities. Okay. So my first argument is that this is an opportunity to talk about shifting the focus when we talk about law. Traditionally, law has been focused on compliance, whether people follow the law. And we need to move from compliance, force-based compliance, coercion, to acceptance. Acceptance is consensual. Cooperation is consensual. Why do we need to do that? Well, one reason is that we haven't really established trust and confidence, and so we have problems of the type I've described. But another is that we're seeing mounting problems related to a coercive system. And I won't go into those in great detail because I think everybody knows. We're facing costs of surveillance when people don't want to obey the law, when they feel coerced. Incarceration, there's just been, the Supreme Court justices just talked about incarceration as a problem. So we see that on our public radar. But more broadly, there's a shift, a social shift in our entire society, in the social sciences across a variety of institutions, to recognizing that cooperation is better than compliance. And that's true across a variety of domains, a variety of different areas. And I just mentioned 4 here. Crime and criminology, there's been much more discussion about how we can't deal with problems of order maintenance without the cooperation of the community. Simple compliance is inadequate. We need people to report crime. We need for them to come to court and testify. If you've read this new book, Ghetto-Side, which is really interesting, I mean, the whole discussion is about how do you get people to testify in court? How do you get them, how can you pursue cases so that if you catch somebody, that person actually gets apprehended? Public affairs, public policy, Putnam is famous. We need engagement in communities, active, willing engagement. Management, An employee who comes to work and simply does their job isn't a good employee anymore. They have to be actively involved, doing extra role type things, being creative and innovative. And in education, we want students who can be creative, be innovative, not rote learning anymore. So the whole shift is occurring in the way we talk about the relationship between people and institutions. Compliance is not enough. We need cooperation. Well, if we're going to shift our goal, I think we have to talk about shifting the means. And here is where psychology can make a big contribution, because legitimacy is central to consent. And if people think the system is fair in the sense that it's legitimate, then they consent and cooperate, which is the goal that we're talking about. This leads to voluntary behavior, so we can reallocate resources away from policing and prisons to development. And it's actually better, is what management shows, because people can be flexible and adaptive. They know their communities. They can do things more effectively in terms of adapting. All right. And so we can also change the relationship between legal authority and the community from a coercive relationship to a cooperative relationship. And that starts to begin the discussion about building trust and confidence. All right. But I would argue that as we move into the 21st century, we can actually think even further in this direction. Law doesn't have to be thought of as a negative force. Law can be thought of as a fundamental force that promotes social solidarity and economic development. To do that, we have to talk about identification. If people identify with their communities, they engage in behaviors in their communities that build those communities. They come to believe in working with their neighbors. They come to believe in working in the community in terms of government, in terms of economic and social development. So there are many benefits to identification. So the law can be a force to build identification and promote the viability of communities. Why think about the law this way? Well, it requires us to think about the law as a force of reassurance. And this is not something I'm coming up with myself. Justices like Justice Breyer and Justice Sotomayor have written recently about the centrality of law as a force that creates a sense of order and reassurance, that the courts need to present to people the sense that law will be maintained, that order will be upheld in the community. And in particular, for the many people who seldom actually deal with the police and courts, it's important that they feel that if they did, they would get fairness, they would get justice, they would get appropriate treatment by legal authorities. And if they feel that way, then they involve themselves in the community. Now, why is this important? Increasingly, when community leaders talk about the police and the courts in their community, what they say is you can't arrest your way out of crime. That in order to solve problems of crime and disorder, what you basically have to do is have economic and social development. You have to have identity with the community so that people participate and involve themselves and think that they can work with others to solve problems. So what I'm going to do is to take those three ideas, compliance, cooperation, and engagement, and talk about them in relationship to legitimacy. And I'll be talking about the national survey that's the basis for the article that I sent you. Because you have the article, I won't talk a lot about the details of the survey, just to say it's a national survey. It's run through a company that maintains a national sample of respondents, and it's set up to be an approximate sample of the American population. All right, so we can compare different models. The model I'm obviously pushing is that the police and courts are legitimate. Other models, they're accurate. They make legally lawful decisions. They manage community problems like crime effectively. And they catch people who break the law. Right. Well, this is just to show that in this sample we get a result that's similar to the results that I showed you in the other slide. A little bit over half of the respondents express high levels of trust and confidence in the police, and courts are always lower. Okay, well, so to the point that I'm trying to make, we have three kinds of behavior that we might want: compliance, cooperation, and engagement. And the question is, can we achieve those goals by a focus on legitimacy? Now this, I won't go into great detail about the data, except to say this is typical of the kind of thing that social scientists do. And it's a regression equation where we're trying to show that different things predict behavior. In this case, compliance with the law. And the crucial point is that the key driver of compliance is legitimacy, with lesser influences of things like the risk. Do the police catch people? So legitimacy drives compliance. Further, legitimacy drives cooperation. And again, we first want cooperation in the sense that people don't engage in revenge and protest, so they accept having the police and the courts resolve problems. They cooperate, help police by reporting crime and criminals, help the courts by serving as a witness and a juror. So legitimacy enhances cooperation. And then finally, legitimacy leads to identification with the community, and together legitimacy and identification encourage what's called social capital, which means neighbors working together, political activity, and economic activity. So the point is, across all three of these different ways of thinking about goals, we always see legitimacy as a prime driver, and in fact, much better driver than risk, because it wouldn't make any sense that risk would drive positive behaviors like engagement. All right. Just to try to make this all heuristically obvious, again, legitimacy, lawfulness, and effectiveness. Legitimacy dominates compliance, dominates cooperation, not resorting to private violence, and then economic and social development in the community. So basically, we can achieve both the traditional objectives of law and new objectives that are really 21st century objectives through building legitimacy, through creating trust and confidence, much more effectively than addressing these other issues, although of course we address them as well, issues like lawfulness and effectiveness in controlling crime. All right. So legitimacy is one factor that shapes all of these kinds of behaviors. And as I said, and as is clear from this, it's distinct from these traditional foci of attention: legality and performance, in such as delivering service, controlling crime. All right. The other thing that flows from this discussion is we need to change the way we think about legitimacy. As I said, legitimacy has been talked about as obligation, trust and confidence, and normative alignment. And obviously, you can see that obligation makes the most sense in terms of compliance, and these other ways of thinking about legitimacy make more sense in terms of cooperation. That's actually what we see empirically, that obligation has the biggest impact on compliance. As we move to cooperation and engagement, the idea of trust and confidence and then shared values increasingly drives people's behavior. So as we try to talk about a different way of thinking about the basis of legal order, we also have to have a broader conception of what people are looking for when they talk about a legitimate authority. It's not just a sense of it's my responsibility to obey. It's also I trust the characteristics of authority, and I think we share goals and values for our community. All right. So hopefully now everyone is very excited about the idea of building legitimacy as a new strategy. And so the question is, how can we do that? What is the basis for legitimacy in general and when people deal with the police and courts? And in particular, what can the police and courts do? What kind of behavior creates and maintains legitimacy? So this then leads to the second key point. Research shows that the legitimacy of the police and the courts is really fundamentally rooted in people's judgments about whether those authorities exercise their authority fairly. The idea of procedural justice, more important than outcomes. For example, when you deal with the police or courts, whether you think you got fair treatment is more important than whether you win or lose your case. When you evaluate the police in your community, whether they can control crime is less important than whether you think they treat people in the community fairly. Procedural justice. And that means 4 things. And again, here I'm reporting on the results of studies of the public. So the public thinks these 4 things are important. They define fair treatment. And I'll go through each one. Decision-making, voice. People feel that they should have a chance to tell their side of the story, state their case, explain their situation. When policies are being created, so there should be community participation, and when they're being implemented. Like when you're stopped by the police or you go to a judge, you should have a chance to tell your side of the story. Say what you think should be done. Neutrality. People look to the law for evidence of lack of bias, accuracy, factuality, consistency in rule application, evaluation based upon the merits and not prejudice. And here the point is that being neutral is not the same thing as being seen as neutral, and often people don't have transparency or accountability, so they don't have any way of knowing. Policies are not explained to them, decisions are not explained to them. They don't see how things are being done, so they don't think that there's any basis for thinking there's neutrality. Quality of treatment. People are very focused on being treated with respect when they deal with authorities. If you look at any police department's complaint file, you will find that almost all of the complaints are about rudeness, disrespect, lack of courtesy. This is very important to people when they deal with legal authorities because legal authorities represent the community, and the way they treat people is a message about standing in the community and standing in society. So people care about that. And people are very concerned with the integrity of the people, the authorities they deal with. In Congress, for example, the question that is most typically used is, are your elected representatives trying to do what's right for the people in the community? And sometimes then there's a little catch to that, or are they acting for special interests? But the do what's best for people in the community is central to evaluations of those leaders and police officers and judges as well. Sincerity, benevolence. Are people in authority trying to think about the needs and concerns of the people that they're responsible for? Again, you have to acknowledge those, and you have to account for decisions so that people can know that you understood and thought about their needs and concerns when you made a decision. Okay, so those are the 4 factors that always emerge in surveys. 2 about how you make decisions, 2 about how you treat people, and that's always, in sum, the most important factor that drives legitimacy. Okay, so let me show you that that's actually true. Or let's say it's a central factor. Here, these are general judgments about the police and courts in people's community. And what's important here is that 2 things are really crucial to being legitimate. Treating people respectfully and being a trustworthy authority, and then making accurate decisions. Those are the 2 factors that drive general judgments about the police and courts and their impact on legitimacy. When people personally deal with the police and courts, it's quality of treatment and fairness of decision-making that dominates impact on legitimacy. Other factors like whether you win or lose, or whether you even think the decision was made accurately drop out, and it becomes all about whether you get treated fairly in the sense that decisions are made fairly and you're treated respectfully by trustworthy authorities. So both in general and in terms of concrete experience, if we want to think about building a system that focuses on legitimacy as a basis of authority, we need to think about how to enact these kinds of changes in the way that the courts and the police treat people in the communities they deal with. All right, and in particular, I would mention, again, quality of treatment. You just really can't imagine how much these factors dominate people's reactions to their dealings with the police and courts. If people feel demeaned or humiliated, that dominates everything else. And when I just did a study of young men in New York City, stop, question, and frisk, if people felt humiliated or demeaned by the police, that was the dominant factor that drove the general impact of being stopped, which was to lower the level of legitimacy and raise the level of criminal conduct. Right. So just treatment builds legitimacy, encourages cooperation, motivates identification, and helps us to turn the law into a force that enables communities to develop themselves better. Right. Well, how does this fit with what's going on in the police? And I focus on the police in particular because 85% of the contact that people have with legal authorities, they have with the police. People don't go to court very often, and the police tend to be when you ask about law, people talk about the police. Well, what have the police done in the last 40 years? They've done two things. One is they've become proactive. So it used to be, if you watch crime shows, you know that the crime show doesn't even start till you see a body lying on the street. That used to be policing, you know, some crime is committed, the police, they investigate, they find the person, they arrest them. It was reactive. Now the police have developed the idea that they can be proactive, that there should never have been a murder in the first place. The police should have prevented it. And so they developed much more proactive strategies, and a proactive strategy, for example, is stop, question, and frisk, where you're basically searching large numbers of people looking for signs of future criminal conduct. And this has changed the way the police think about people. They're managing the public from a point of view of risk assessment. And another way to put this is they look at everyone that they deal with from the perspective of suspiciousness or future criminality. Are you the kind of person who will commit a crime in the future? Now, this suspicion-based focused gaze on the public, I would argue, is inconsistent with the idea of building trust. And that is, if people feel that they are mistrusted and treated in a suspicious way by the police, they come to mistrust the police in return. So a different aspect of the survey that I told you about but isn't in this article is trying to show that that's true. So how does being suspected, feeling suspected by the police shape your social relationship with the police? Whether you feel that you respect the police, whether you think the police respect you, whether you trust their motives. So this is an analysis of the impact of feeling like a suspect on legitimacy. And what it shows is that people who feel that the police treat them like they're a suspect, like they think they might be engaged in criminal conduct, or they're the kind of person who might commit a crime, have a much more negative relationship with the police. They don't identify with the police. They don't have trust in the police motives. They don't think the police respect them as members of the community. And having a good relationship with the police is central to viewing them as legitimate. So you're destroying the central basis of legitimacy by undermining this social relationship. And the other factors that we talked about, like control and crime, are really pretty irrelevant, as we've seen already. So this is a way of showing you why it is that strategies of law enforcement are, in fact, causing trust and confidence to be undermined. Well, how do you know that the police suspect you? As I'm sure you're all aware, the police don't stop people and say, I stopped you because you're black. You know, you have to figure out, why did the police stop me? And one of the central cues that people use to try to make that judgment is how fairly they're treated by the police. So if the police treat you disrespectfully, if they humiliate you, they don't explain why they stopped you, you think that you're the kind of person that the police suspect of being a criminal. And as we saw, that then leads to lowered legitimacy. Obviously, there are other factors. You might feel suspected. You might feel suspected more if you're a minority group member, and that's definitely true. If you live in a high-crime neighborhood. But these are things that you can't really change. You can definitely change the way the police treat people. And so if the police didn't treat people in these humiliating, demeaning ways, people would be less likely to feel like suspected criminals and less likely to have low legitimacy ratings of the police. And just to talk about what does this mean in concrete terms, in the study that Jeff Fagan and I did of young men being stopped by the NYPD, if you control for criminal propensity, young men who feel unfairly treated by the police are twice as likely to be engaged in criminal conduct. So this lowered legitimacy leads to heightened levels of rule breaking. So what's the big picture argument here? If we bring psychology into discussions about legal authority, it's a potentially useful and new way of thinking about a lot of questions that we've talked about. And the point is that it's different than traditional conceptions of performance. It allows a redefinition of legal authority. Actually, did you want to ask me a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure I get the connection. I'm saying that if a young man, old man, whatever, is disrespected by the police, then they're more likely to commit a crime or to do.
I'm saying, yes, I'm saying that,
Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that the level of criminal behavior is connected to whether people have trust and confidence in the police. And if people lack trust and confidence in the police, they engage in higher levels of criminal conduct. And we can actually see the translation from unfair treatment to lower legitimacy to higher levels of criminal conduct. So that's the argument.
You mean in the population or you mean in the individual?
Well, in the individual.
Otherwise law-abiding, they're disrespected by the police and then they become a criminal?
Well,
I mean, is that what you're saying?
not they become a criminal, they engage in higher levels of criminal activity. You know, I mean, many of these people are committing crimes on some level, but they do more. Okay? Okay, all right. So the idea is we change the way we think about legal authority, and it's not something that's imposed or bought with service delivery. It's something that is flowing from people's connection to authority, that they trust authority, they're confident in the qualities of authority, and so therefore they want to accept authority and follow rules. Okay, so we gain the benefits of voluntary compliance, and we avoid a lot of the problems that are associated with the current system of deterrence. Well, one question is, can we do both? And the argument would be that starting with threatening people or using force is that it undermines values. So what we can do is we can move to a value-based approach where we approach the general public, and particularly young people, from a trust perspective, and that would gain us a lot. We estimate 90 to 95%, I put 85 to 90% the population can be reached in this way, and there's always going to be a smaller group that really doesn't have the capacity to act on values, so we might have to use instrumental approaches with that group. But if we use values first, we can capture almost everyone with that approach. Okay, so what are the implications of this? I think there are several. One is we focus on value creation. We don't talk very much now about schools and children and value creation, but that's really central to building trust and confidence, especially because 95% of the experience that people have with legal authorities they have before they're 18. Now, that's obviously not multiple murder and things like that. That's drunken disorderly or vandalism or whatever. But most of the contact that people have with the police in particular, but also the courts, they have when they're young. So if we change the strategy for those contacts, we can change trust and confidence at an early age, and obviously we can change it with adults as well. We need to evaluate every policy and practice in terms of its impact on legitimacy, stop, question, and frisk, mandatory minimums, whatever it is. We also consider it in terms of impact on the legitimacy of the police and courts, and we need to monitor the climate of legitimacy. One of the reasons there's so much focus on crime rates and crime control is that that's the only thing we measure. If you are a police leader and you want to show that you are doing a good job, the only metric that you have is crime rate. You don't have typically measures of legitimacy. If you are a court administrator, you have time to disposition, you have cost of disposition, you don't have impact on the legitimacy of the people who go through your system. If we have those indicators, we can monitor climate and we can reinforce the people who build legitimacy. We can promote them, we make them police chiefs, give them Officer of the Year awards. So these are things we can do. All right. So I think this is just summarizing what I already said. We know how to do it, we just have to want to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Did I answer your question? Was that clear?
I understood what you're saying.
Okay. You don't agree with me, but you, okay, that's fine.
Before we start with questions, I was asked to announce before, but didn't, that if you want CLE credit, it would be very helpful if you turn in evaluations that you have later, and you'll pick up your certificates as you leave. I have a question, but I'm going to hold off in deference to Miriam. We'll have the first question.
So my question for you is, what is the implication of legitimacy theory for wrongdoing by police officers, right? So police officers violate the law, police officers violate the Fourth Amendment, Constitution. Right. So what is the implication of legitimacy theory for when the police violate the law? Because right now, the emphasis, if anything, has been on what you would call sort of accountability and really coercion, right? Telling the police, hey, if you guys don't comply, we're going to punish you. And if anything, the complaint has been that we haven't punished enough. So what does legitimacy say about that?
Okay. I think there are two levels of response. One thing is to say to the police, to officers, one of the central ways that the people in the community evaluate the police is whether those police officers are fair. And if you're corrupt, if you violate the law, people don't perceive you as being fair, you undermine trust and confidence, you encounter a lot of problems in your daily work. And so there are a lot of costs to you. But the other thing I would say that I think is a really interesting other level of reaction is this work all started out saying that the point was for the police and the courts to treat the public fairly, to get public compliance. Well, it turns out that a lot of research now on police departments shows that police officers feel exactly the same way about their superiors as the public feels about the police. The police say, no one treats me fairly, no one explains anything to me, I don't trust my leaders. And we find that if you treat police officers fairly in their own police force, they are much more likely to follow rules. So there's legitimacy on that level too, and it has the same impact. The police follow policies when they feel that the force is legitimate because they experience fairness in their own department. So I think there's kind of two answers to your question.
Larry.
I was wondering, apropos of this, I always intuitively felt that if the police were required to live in their jurisdiction, and of course in New York the unions of the city has blocked that, but has there ever been a study on these questions of legitimacy where there were comparable demographic communities where there was residency requirement and there wasn't? Because it seems to me if you want to create this sort of Martin Buber I-thou relationship as opposed to the I-it relationship, that would be one of the key factors in the subliminal, if not the direct psychology of of the relationship?
I think it's a really good argument. I don't know of a study that specifically looks at that, but I'll tell you about some evidence that I think supports it. In communities where the police are trying to address these kinds of issues, one approach that they've taken is taking young officers and sending them to foot patrol in neighborhoods. And the idea is the same one, that if you send officers to spend their first year on foot patrol in a particular neighborhood, even a high crime neighborhood, they get to know all the people in that community. And they get to actually understand that even in a high crime community, 95% of the people are not committing crime. And so they get a much more differentiated sense of what the community is like. They build up relationships with people. So they're not necessarily physically living there, but they're working there. And they're working there in very similar conditions where they get embedded in the community. That's been very successful. And so I think that would suggest that you could further push that by arguing for the value of officers living in communities. Yes. I mean, so I can't point to a study, but I can point to some evidence that's very supportive of that idea.
I'm going to ask the next question, which is, you mentioned Justice Breyer speaking about the rate of incarceration. I believe Justice Kennedy did also.
Yes, they did. Yes.
And we have by far the highest rate of incarceration on a per capita basis of any country that I know anything about. How much does that put everything you said off to a bad start? Because there was a law review article a number of years ago called "Let the Crime Fit the Punishment," where even the judges are very disturbed about having to mete out such harsh penalties, given what the behavior was.
Right. Well, I think that it's not a good place to start from, but it's where we are. So I think we have to try to make the case, what are the costs of this approach? And what's really striking to me is, given how many resources we devote to our prison system, particularly to very long sentences, the evidence is strikingly clear that those do not have a deterrent effect. So we're basically throwing away a lot of money, and that money could be spent, I'm arguing, on this much superior strategy that would yield much better benefits and has the advantage of actually being really cheap. So what you were talking about with the strategy of policing in this way is retraining, developing new policies and practices, and then getting the benefits of more cooperation, which lets you lower the level of expenditure for law enforcement and definitely for prisons. In cities that have used these kind of models, one of the really striking increases is in clearance rates. And that means basically that the public helps the police solve crimes. They're willing to report crimes, they're willing to identify criminals, they're willing to testify. All of those things then reduce the crime rate, reduce the problems of subsequent imprisonment. So yes, I think it's a very big problem, and it's such a big problem that, as you said, even Supreme Court justices are talking about it. It was interesting, they were talking about it at the annual meeting about the budget for the court system. So they clearly see this as an important problem.
Liz?
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question. You briefly mentioned mandatory minimum. I wasn't quite sure where you were going with it in terms of, is there some threshold that you have to have of, social perception of general fairness before any of this works, or is it just a piece of it,
right.
or how, perhaps you could say a little bit more.
Sure, it's actually. I should have been careful about talking about mandatory minimums because it is a different issue than what I'm talking about here. But I think the corresponding argument is that it's the perception of unfairness that's driving a lot of the impact of sentencing on loss of legitimacy. The idea of mandatory minimums for certain kinds of crimes, but then, for example, white-collar crimes, much less severe punishment. So it's a sense of the unfairness of the system.
There are so many
right.
unfairnesses.
I got it.
I'm sure you're right that being treated fairly in your civilly in your contact with the police is hugely important. But how big a piece of the pie is it when you have everything from this, income inequality to
Right.
mandatory minima to huge percentages of people being incarcerated?
Well, those are all good questions, and all I can say is that we see the possibility in the behavior of the police and courts to change things that have been causing a lot of problems. And I think if those changes were made, it would be a much better system, and it would be generally viewed by the public as much more legitimate and acceptable. But obviously there are deeper structural issues that are not addressed by these kind of problems, and I would agree with that. You know, it's a thing that can be done. What I like about this approach is it, from my point of view, it transforms the way we think about the legal system, where we're focused now so much on force and trying to coerce people into doing things and having, therefore, a negative relationship with people. If you shift over to talking about legitimacy, you become very concerned about how the people experience the system and how can we get people to engage in and cooperate with the system. And that has implications all through. It would help to address problems in prisons because, you know, they're the end of the system with many arrests, and if there were fewer arrests, there'd be fewer prisoners. But I definitely don't want to oversell this. There are many fundamental problems that might be partially addressed by this, but certainly not completely.
Actually, I have two questions that are somewhat related, but just a different premise as well. The first is a presentation like this, or somewhat maybe more, have these become, or are people sort of developing this as part of the training that police officers get and other people as well? Maybe, yeah, I'm thinking maybe a little bit different, more specific in application. And the second one is the legitimacy that you seem to have been emphasizing during this presentation is one of the social system. But I'm sort of wondering if in another way this could be also adapted in the prison system after people are in prison, rather than just saying, okay, this is it, you know, choice two.
Right.
We didn't work, and I think there's a certain percentage, like you said, 10 to 15% where it's not going to work. But there's also a lot of people who swept into the criminal justice system, where in the prison system itself you could apply some of this to try to reignite, instill in whatever portion of the prison system there is. Maybe instead of the 85%, maybe it's only 50%. But to try to use the legitimization of the law as a educational tool in the prison system itself to try to reduce recidivism.
And I absolutely agree with that. There are two findings that are relevant to what you're saying. One is, if inmates experience prisons as being fair, there's much less violence. So in prison, there's a lower level of violence towards other inmates and guards, and then recidivism rates are lower after people get out of prison if they have retained a stronger sense of the legitimacy of the law because it hasn't been diminished by unfair conditions. Now you're pushing a little further and saying maybe the prisons could actually even build legitimacy, and that's a great idea. The research so far has been primarily directed at trying to slow down what seems to be the general decrease in legitimacy that goes with being in prison. But I will give you one example that I think suggests that your argument makes sense. There's a great study that was done in Chicago. People come out of prison and they've been in prison for violent crimes, so their projected recidivism rate is very high. Normally, when you come out of prison, you are put down in chairs like this and you have law enforcement people like me standing here saying, we're watching you, you break the law, we'll catch you, you're going back to prison, we know who you are. So they didn't do that. They had a round table, they had the people sitting with the law enforcement officers. The law enforcement officers said, first, we think you have the potential to do well. We want to help you do well. We're concerned about the possibility that you would go back, but we think there's also the possibility that you can build a good life in the community. What can we do to help you? Tell us about your concerns, tell us about your issues. In other words, they treated them very fairly and respectfully. They showed in the 3 years after that, there was a 40% reduction in recidivism among this group that was fairly treated, and this is like a 1 or 2 hour meeting after they get out of prison. So even the population that we think of as hardened prisoners is very responsive when they receive fair treatment. And that, I think, goes with the argument that you're making, that prisons also, even post-prison, can be a chance to do these things. The other thing you said is about training, and yes, actually a big step forward has been the development of training programs by the COPS office. In Chicago, 16,000 officers were retrained using procedural justice training, and I'm evaluating that project, and I can tell you that the officers actually liked it, and it changed their attitudes about the community. So yes, we need to retrain officers. Now, I would say that the big change that I'm very excited about is in the task force on 21st century policing that was just released last month. The whole first chapter is about trust and confidence as the basis of the relationship between the police and the community. If you had written that report 15 years ago, it wouldn't have even mentioned trust and confidence. It would have been all about crime control. So I feel like the whole culture, maybe I'm optimistic, but I like to think that the whole culture through which we think about policing and legal authority is starting to change, with a lot more emphasis on how the community experiences law and law enforcement.
I don't want to embarrass Tom, but he was writing about it 15 years ago. And he was not a lone voice, but there weren't too many voices back then. And there's really been a lot of progress. Mary Ellen?
So, I want to ask maybe a
Sure.
contrarian question. It's hard to be against cooperation and trust, and in favor of coercion and compulsion, and maybe I'm not. But it strikes me that it would be interesting to hear your views on the decline, the drastic decline in crime rate over the last 10 years. Whereas we're seeing it at the same time as there's decline in authority or in trust in authority. And it seems a little counter to some of the points that you're making. And I guess, I don't think you meant this or were saying this in a way to diminish the significance of crime control, because of course that's important to all of us in all sorts of communities, including the ones that feel abandoned by the authorities. And of course that is what has been measured, as opposed to confidence in the police.
Right.
But it strikes me as there's some tension there with the legitimacy approach
Right.
and the effectiveness of the coercion.
Right. Well, it's absolutely true that even today, crime control is the defining feature that we talk about. And two cities where there's been a lot of effort to use these legitimacy-based approaches are Chicago and New Haven. And that even in those efforts, the constant thing that the leaders have to keep saying is that all of this has not increased the crime rate. So I therefore am confident in saying that these other approaches are at least as effective in maintaining whatever crime rate we have. But I think your question is really a lot deeper. And that question is, why did the crime rate go down, basically? And that would be a great 3-hour seminar, to talk about this issue. There are really different points of view about how much the police were responsible for crime declines. And I can only say that it seems clear that particular police policies and practices have not had much impact on the general crime rate, as evidenced by the fact that places like Canada, where the police have done none of the things that they've done in America, have exactly the same drop in the crime rate. So we could at least make the argument that it's not this particular things the police are doing that are driving this crime rate, and therefore they don't have to do them. They could do other things, and we could still hopefully have this crime rate drop. But I also even more. Right, that's what I would argue. Right, that's what I would argue. But the point is, I do agree with you that addressing that question has been, and I think continues to be central to any kind of an argument about changing policing. In particular, if the police believe that what they've done has been responsible for the crime drop, then they're very reluctant to change. And so whether it's true or not, it's important politically. But also, of course, it's important, as you're saying, in reality, because if what they were doing was causing the drop, we'd be very reluctant to ask them to change. I would argue that there's a lot of evidence that that's not true. And you know, I can give you cites. And others can give other cites, like Frank Zimmering wrote a book where he said, you know, the NYPD is fantastic, they cut the crime rate. A lot of people don't agree with that book. So there's certainly a controversy about this issue.
Yes, ma'am.
I understand completely being able to get police to learn to be respectful. That's a really, in some ways, easy thought. But when you talk about the changing values, as a practical matter, how do you see all of these elements of getting an opportunity to be heard and having a fair procedure? How do you actually see that happening? Because theoretically, it's very good. I think that it's important people have the chance to be heard. They feel they're treated fairly. All of that is important. But how do you actually put that into effect?
Okay, well, so the way that we've been trying to put it into effect is by encouraging retraining of police. And so it's great now, like, as I said, Chicago has retrained their entire police force. The Department of Justice has put together all these training curriculums. So if you're a police force that has 20 officers, we can mail you an 8-hour curriculum. You don't have to develop it. So we have training material readily available. We're encouraging departments to use it. The President's Task Force, one of their recommendations is that the government fund metrics of legitimacy so that there would be an alternative to the crime rate, pay to have evidence collected about the impact of police on legitimacy so that those numbers would be available. You know, if you think about it nowadays, who gets the award? Who's on the cover of, you know, Police magazine? It's the people who arrest a lot of people, because that's the only metric that we really have. But imagine if the police chief is standing there giving an award to a person who built trust and confidence in the community that they're in charge of, or that person is the person who becomes the next captain. The police will change if, you know, the value system in the department changes, if they're given the skills to treat people differently. And then I've been doing a lot of work with unions, and there are two principal arguments for unions. One is it's actually much safer for police officers to police in this way, because these force-based strategies escalate conflict, they lead to more violent incidents, and it's true that usually it's the civilian that ends up dead, but more than you might imagine, the police officers end up at least badly injured. One of the things that happens to a lot of police officers is that they're not just dealing with one person in a community, there's 20 people standing around them by the time they're trying to arrest somebody. And those 20 people are more than enough match for even an armed officer. So it's dangerous, and it's less dangerous if you use these kind of strategies, and we can prove that. The other thing is, being a police officer in this kind of a style of policing is very damaging to police officers. The physical and mental health of police officers is terrible. Alcoholism, suicide, divorce, stress-related illnesses of all kinds. And if the police in this different way that's less stressful and doesn't cause them to constantly feel they're in a hostile and antagonistic environment, their health goes up. So again, you know, an argument for police unions is, you know, you don't care about the public, but you care about your officers. And your officers that you represent are a lot better off if you change the style of policing. So those are some of the things that I would say we can do. And, you know, as Larry said, I think there's been a big transformation. Now we have national leaders talking about all of these ideas.
Last question.
There's also something called the exclusionary rule. So if the police violate your constitutional rights and they seize contraband, And you could take them to court and you could have the evidence suppressed. And that's one way of getting justice because of police misconduct. And in those instances where there is no contraband, then the citizen can sue through tort law for negligence on the part of the city for not training the police properly and for allowing them to conduct these illegal searches when there's nothing found. So that's two other courses that to get justice.
Okay. And actually, since you asked the question earlier, let me just say, if any of you are interested in the study that I mentioned on young men being stopped by the police, that's actually published in the Journal of Empirical Legal Studies in 2014. So you can take a look and see if you find the evidence to be convincing. So on stop, question, frisk.
Well, I heard a small hint that Tom was willing to stay for another 3-hour seminar, but we're not going to take him up on it. But if you look to your right and my left, you'll see that there's going to be more opportunity for informal engagement, and it will not be hostile or coercive. So this was such a terrific talk. Thank you so much, Tom.